All right, Sir Mark Lyall Grant is the former National Security Advisor for the United Kingdom. He was also the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations. Hello, Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening.
Good to see you again. How significant is this withdrawal, first of all, around Kherson announced by the Russians?
I think it is significant simply because Kherson was the first sort of major new city for Russia to take when they invaded the rest of Ukraine in February this year. So they've now lost that territory. Kherson is also the capital of one of the four provinces which they annexed just last month, and with great fanfare, Putin announcing that these were now part of the Russian territory. So essentially, he doesn't control 100% of any of these four territories that he's annexed, and he doesn't control two of the capital cities of those territories, both Zaporizhzhia and now shortly Kherson. So I think it is symbolic in that. It is a defeat for President Putin. It's noticeable that he hasn't appeared on television to announce this withdrawal. It's been left to some of the senior generals. And although the Ukrainians are reacting cautiously, obviously fearful that the Russians have laid some booby traps or are planning some sort of late ambush, nonetheless, I think it is a very significant victory for them and therefore important for continued Western support for the Ukrainian government.
So you believe that the support should continue? Should it increase? And you, in watching the U.S. midterm elections, are you concerned about how a Republican-controlled House will affect any of that?
Well, so far, I mean, the military support for Ukraine, the vast majority of which, let's be honest, has come from the Americans, although the Europeans have chipped in with quite a lot of military equipment in more recent months, is supported by, bipartisan way in America. However, there is certainly a fringe, maybe more than a fringe of the Republican Party that believes that enough is enough and America should no longer be offering all this financial and military support to Ukraine. So if the Republicans do gain control of the Senate, then I think it would become more difficult for President Biden to continue that support. If they just take control of the House, but the Senate remains divided or in the hands of the Democrats, then I think the policy will continue as it is at the moment.
How long do you think the United States and Europe will continue to support aid to Ukraine, military aid? Does it go back to 2014? Borders, and I wouldn't call them borders, but ceasefire lines. Or do you think that Europe and the US will continue to support Ukraine if and when they may start attacking and shelling the Crimea itself?
I think they will continue to support. I mean, there is very widespread support within the G7 as a whole and within the European continent for Ukraine. I think this winter is obviously going to be difficult, but once we're through that, I would expect the support for Ukraine to ramp up even further, to be honest. So I don't sense any lessening of that support for Ukraine. Now, what is also happening behind the scenes is that the United States in particular are putting some pressure on President Zelensky to make clear that he is open to talks, dialogue with the Russians about a possible end to the conflict. Zelensky has said, yes, I am prepared to do that, but provided there are a number of conditions. And one of them is that Russia should be prepared to discuss withdrawing from all the territory of Ukraine, including Crimea, not just the new territories they've taken since February this year. Now, that I don't see that being an opportunity for early serious negotiations because Putin could not accept that. It would just be an even greater fate than had so far in Crimea.
Are you as shocked at these figures that U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, released this week where he said there's 100,000 soldiers that have been either KIA or missing or wounded on the Russian side. And then he was asked the same about Ukraine, and he said the same number, 100,000. And then in addition, he added 40,000 civilian deaths into this. I mean, that is a stunning number of killed and wounded.
It is a stunning number. I think it's very difficult to be totally confident of figures on either side of this conflict. The Ukrainians are saying that 75,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. Now, normally there would be a ratio of something like 1 to 3, 1 to 4 in terms of deaths to injuries. That would suggest even larger figures on the Russian side. I don't think what the Americans have released is completely out of order. I think there have been very heavy losses on both sides and a very high percentage of deaths on both sides, undoubtedly. And that's aside, of course, the Ukrainian civilians have been killed.
Do you see an emerging ideology in Russia, something that we haven't seen before when you listen to these speeches by President Putin, most recently, it's not the first time, but most recently going on and on against liberal Western democracy and defeating Satanism. And I mean, how do you read that?
Well, I think for some time, Putin has tried to set himself up as the so-called defender of family values, traditional values, if you like. And he believes that the West is in decline and that he points to issues around LGBT rights, for instance, as an example of that decline. And so he has deliberately positioned himself at the more conservative end of that spectrum and saying, look, the West is got decadent, it's disappearing, and here is an opportunity for Russia to regain its historical strength. He sees that task of making Russia great again, if you excuse the phrase, in very zero-sum terms, that the only way he can do that when Russia is, has a stagnant population and a very narrow-based economy, very few allies around the world, by weakening his perceived enemies, whether that be the European Union, NATO, the United States, the United Kingdom, etc. So he uses the hard power tools that he has at his disposal because he doesn't have so many soft power tools as a country like China perhaps has, for example. So I'm not sure it's an ideology. I think it's more a nostalgia and a nationalism harking back to the great days of the Russian or Soviet empires.
I mean, it may be a very clever way to appeal to conservatives in the US as well. He's always trying to divide, so-called liberal democracies or democracies as well. And by playing on the LGBTQ differences in the US, I mean, he may feel that helps divide America somehow.
Yes, certainly. And there is a sort of Trumpist wing of the Republican Party that is rather sympathetic to some of those ideological views. And of course, Trump himself seemed to give Putin a relatively easy ride when he was president of the United States. And I'm sure that President Putin would be delighted if President Trump ran again in a couple of years' time and actually won the presidency back.
As a former national security advisor, I know you're well connected and you talk to your colleagues. And while the answer may seem obvious to you, I'd appreciate you kind of giving us your insight about why is it so important, especially in Europe, when people talk about Russia cannot be seen to be victorious in Ukraine. I mean, what are you really fighting?
I think you are fighting for a preservation of the post-Second World War international order. A lot of the boundaries across the world, particularly in Africa, for instance, are man-made. They're relatively recent. And that is the case in Europe as well. And if one allows those borders to be violated with impunity, then I think the whole underpinning and structure of this post-Second World War consensus falls apart. And that is the threat that Western democracies are now faced. If Russia and China start leading a rebellion, if you like, against that international order and promoting a separate, different order based on different values, not based on democracy, open trade, human rights, the rule of law, the things on which the current order is based, if they manage to succeed in attracting some developing countries, some more neutral countries into their camp, then I think that poses a very serious long-term strategic threat to the Western way of life. And I think that's what's at stake in this union.
Mr. Ambassador, just the last question to you, if you'll permit me, and that is, as a former permanent representative to the United Nations for the UK, I mean, obviously the UN was one of the safeguards of that post, war period to create, stability around the world, and to stop, the movement of borders and expansion of countries, and to bring kind of a, world stability. And then now you have Russia, which is dedicated to, promoting chaos, whether it be in the Middle East or Africa, or whether now it be, right here in Europe. Why is Russia, do you think, still allowed to sit on the UN Security Council? And should there be a move to remove them?
Well, the simple answer, if you like, Dana, to that question is that in order to remove a permanent member of the Security Council from the Security Council, it requires not only a large majority of UN members, theoretically possible, but also the agreement of all 5 existing permanent members, including Russia. So obviously Russia is not going to permit itself to be voted off the UN Security Council. So that won't happen. Now, is that an undesirable situation? Yes, of course it is. I think it's more the principle that has been violated, I think, in the UN Charter, is that the UN Charter makes clear that if there is a conflict issue in which one of the Security Council members are directly involved, they should not vote on that issue. Now, it is that statute in the UN Charter that has been violated. Unfortunately, it is potentially in the interests of all the 5 permanent members to not abide by that, because they feel that there may be particular conflicts in which they're involved where they still want to have the veto. But it is possible to say under the UN Charter, Russia should not be allowed to vote when there is an issue like the Ukraine conflict where they are directly involved.
And how would that help the
only
situation?
Way of trying to overcome the paralysis that there currently is in the Security Council. It isn't possible to vote Russia off the council.
But how would that help the situation if Russia had to abide by, not being allowed to vote on the UN Security Council? Where would that have taken us?
Well, then potentially you would be able to get enforceable sanctions imposed on Russia, which every country in the world would have to abide by. Now, of course, China might still veto sanctions against Russia. But suppose that they didn't feel able to do that or willing to do that, it would mean that the sanctions that are imposed on Russia at the moment are only imposed essentially by Western countries, the European Union, the United States, the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc., not by China or India or Brazil or South Africa. Now, if there was a Security Council resolution imposing those sanctions, as there is, for instance, on Iran or on North Korea, then every country in the world would be obliged to abide by that sanctions, and it would have much more effect.
Sir Mark Lyall Grant, always a privilege to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Dana.